Hey guys, it's me, Rich. You probably noticed something very strange happening again. Right as Americans are finally recovering from the chaos of COVID, the World Health Organization, the WHO, suddenly reappears with another international emergency warning tied to Ebola cases in Africa. This video breaks down why millions of Americans no longer trust these global health organizations, how the Biden administration quietly pushed for stronger WHO authority over American sovereignty, and why Trump's decision to pull America out of the WHO may have stopped something bigger from happening. But if you stick with me to the end of this video, you'll figure out that this story isn't really about Ebola at all. It's about power for the globalist elites. Let's get into it. All right, guys, welcome back to RPW Media. Look, if you like our videos and you haven't done so already, you should become a subscriber to the channel. You can hit the notification bell, smack that like button, because it helps us get our message out to more people, and you will be notified every time we put out a new video. And thank you very much. All right, so here we go again, right? Another emergency, another global warming, another press conference from unelected bureaucrats standing behind podiums telling ordinary people they need to panic immediately because somewhere in the world a disease outbreak is happening. And maybe under normal circumstances, people would simply nod along and trust the expert. But after COVID, after lockdowns, forced business closures, you lose your job, school shutdowns, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, censorship, and nonstop propaganda from corporate media, Americans are looking at this latest WHO announcement with the kind of skepticism normally reserved for used car salesmen and MSNBC legal analysts. But what you'll soon realize is that the timing of this entire thing raises questions that a lot of people in Washington desperately do not want asked. Because according to the World Health Organization, a relatively small Ebola outbreak in Uganda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo suddenly became serious enough to justify an international public health emergency warning. Are you kidding me? Now listen carefully to the warning that they used, because if you survive COVID with your sanity intact, this language sounds hauntingly familiar. Here it is. Pursuant to paragraph 2 of Article 12, the Director General of the World Health Organization, after having consulted the state's parties where the event is known to be currently occurring, is hereby determining that the Ebola disease caused by the Bundibugyo virus in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda constitutes a public health emergency of international concern. Are you kidding me? But does not meet the criteria of pandemic emergency. The event constitutes a public health risk to other states' parties through the international spread of disease. International spread has already been documented with 2 confirmed cases reported in Kampala, Uganda. All right, 2 confirmed cases. Dos. Just 2. That became the justification for an international emergency declaration, guys. The Americans are supposed to hear that and think, oh yes, this all seems perfectly reasonable. Really? Because during COVID, the public learned something incredibly important. These institutions do not simply provide information anymore. They shape narratives. They create fear environments. They pressure governments into action. They influence elections, economies, schools, travel, churches, and businesses. Look at the people walking around you that still wear masks. And somehow every single emergency always seems to expand government power while shrinking your individual freedoms. Funny how that works, isn't it? Now, to be fair, the WHO did stop short of declaring a full pandemic. By modern standards, that probably qualifies as remarkable constraint. But there's one enormous difference that's now seen compared to 2020. Donald Trump pulled the United States out of the WHO earlier this year. Now, that matters. Guys, it matters a lot more than many Americans probably realize, because Tedros Ghebreyesus can stand in front of the cameras all day long making dramatic statements about international health emergencies, but he can no longer direct leverage over the United States government the way global bureaucrats hoped they would be doing during the Biden years. And that leads us directly into something that the corporate press barely covered at all. During the Biden administration, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, participated in negotiations surrounding proposed WHO pandemic reforms. Now, this is where things started getting extremely uncomfortable for a lot of Americans who were paying attention. Originally, the WHO declarations were largely treated as guidance. That's how the WHO wrote it. Sovereign nations could evaluate the recommendations and decide whether they made sense for their own citizens. That's called national sovereignty, right? You know, that old-fashioned concept where Americans govern America instead of unelected international organizations in Europe governing America. Okay, but critics became alarmed because the Biden administration supported efforts that would give the WHO directives far greater weight during future global emergencies. The sovereign coalition blocked it. An intense pushback occurred behind closed doors. In other words, Blinken wanted to, through Joe Biden, wanted to make it so that regions no longer could say, no, we're not going to follow that. It was mandatory. An unelected bureaucratic body in Europe, Biden wanted to give away our sovereignty to it. Are you kidding me? So a coalition of African nations led by Botswana, along with countries like Brazil, India, Iran, and Russia, believe it or not, explicitly opposed that U.S. proposal. They argued that removing the requirement to consult with the target state, and it was a direct assault on their national sovereignty, and it was. And millions of Americans looked at this and said, yeah, absolutely not. Because Americans already experienced what happens when bureaucrats gain emergency powers with no accountability. And our legacy media, well, they absolutely went along with all of it during COVID. I mean, all of it. You remember it. You remember being told you couldn't visit dying relatives. You remember children forced out of classrooms had to learn at home. You remember businesses permanently destroyed while Walmart stayed open. Also Amazon, big donors to the Democrats. You remember politicians dining at fancy restaurants maskless while lecturing the public about the science. You remember being told masks worked. Then masks didn't work. Then masks definitely worked again. You remember the 2 weeks to slow the spread, right? Magically transforming into years of emergency powers. Once a dictator gets those kinds of powers, they never want to give it up. And perhaps most insulting of all, you remember being called dangerous for simply asking questions. Most of MAGA ask questions. They call us nuts. Turns out in the end, we were right. That info's coming out right now. That's part that Americans have not forgotten. And honestly, they probably never will. But on the other hand, what makes this story even stranger is the sudden appearance of reports involving the U.S. government scientists allegedly transporting a dangerous pathogen samples back into the United States from the Congo. Yes, really. This guy should be hung. According to reports from Children's Health Defense, the FBI reportedly opened an investigation involving NIH virologist Vincent Munster after allegations surfaced that he returned from the DRC carrying pathogen samples, including monkeypox. Democrats immediately went to the aid of the virologist. Now, I made that last part up, but doesn't it sound like something Democrats would do today? Now, let's be responsible and fair here, okay? The FBI has not publicly confirmed these reports yet. And one reckless scientist does not automatically prove some giant coordinated conspiracy. Reasonable adults understand that. But here's the problem the federal health establishment created for itself. After years of lying, censorship, narrative manipulation, and moving goalposts during COVID, millions of Americans no longer automatically dismiss suspicious coincidences. That trust is gone. And the people responsible for destroying that trust still cannot seem to understand why. Think about the cast of characters Americans were forced to watch for years. Anthony Fauci, Rochelle Walensky, Deborah Birx. Every CNN medical contributor pretending that changing science somehow always perfectly aligned with Democratic political messaging. Okay? These people stopped sounding like neutral scientists years ago. They sounded like political operatives wearing medical credentials as armor. And Americans noticed. We always notice. The public noticed when experts contradicted themselves every few weeks. The public noticed when dissenting scientists got silenced. You were canceled. The public noticed when social media platforms coordinated censorship campaigns. all at the behest of the Biden administration that we learned. And public notice when perfectly reasonable questions became labeled misinformation and disinformation, and it was dangerous. You should be arrested. And that skepticism did not appear out of nowhere. It was earned. And now here we are watching another international health emergency unfold right as America heads toward another critical election cycle. Coincidence? Maybe. But millions of Americans are no longer willing to blindly accept official narratives simply because people with government titles demand obedience. Screw that. That's the real story here. This isn't even primarily about Ebola. It's about the permanent bureaucratic class that survives every scandal, every administration, every failed prediction, and every abuse of power. Presidents come and go. Elections come and go. But somehow the same unelected bureaucrats remain permanently embedded inside the system, gaining more authority after every crisis. And notice the pattern. If the emergency is climate change, they want control over energy use. If the public health has a problem, they want control over your movement, your church, your business, and your child's schools. If it's misinformation, they want to control speech. Every crisis somehow ends with ordinary citizens having fewer freedoms and government institutions having more power. Every single time. That pattern is why Americans are skeptical now. Because they're not stupid. Because they're not conspiracy theorists. Because they lived through it already. And this time, many Americans see the playbook before the game even starts. The good news is this country is waking up to this nonsense. You see it every day. More Americans are questioning centralized authority. More Americans are rejecting fear-based manipulation. More Americans are remembering that governments exist to serve citizens, not rule over them like frightened children. And perhaps most importantly, Americans are finally realizing that freedom is not something you temporarily surrender during every manufactured emergency and crisis, and you'll magically somehow get it back later. You never do. History shows that governments almost never give power back willingly once they take it. That lesson may end up being the single most important thing Americans have learned from COVID. So at the end of the day, this story, okay, is not about denying diseases exist. It's about recognizing how fear can be weaponized by political institutions that benefit from public panic. Americans have every right to ask questions after what they experienced during COVID. There still has not been a reckoning for that. And this time around, far more people seem prepared to defend their freedoms before the emergency powers start rolling in. That awareness alone is a major shift in this country. I love it. And honestly, it may be one of the healthiest signs America has shown in years. So tell me what you think in the comments below. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.